Telepathic distortion? Misty opened her mind, slowly gliding across the surface thoughts of those around her. Most of them were consumed with what to order, their meal, or the date they were on. But there were some that were distressed, upset, angry. The ones' thoughts that came in clearly were couples having a little spat. But the ones emitting a stronger sense of discomfort were muted to her somehow. She could sense them, but she couldn't reach them. Misty sighed and closed her mind off. "Any luck?" asked Daniel. Her husband sat across from her enjoying his lasagna. Misty shook her head. Daniel smiled. "Wouldn't have sent in the A-team if it had been that easy." Misty snorted. Daniel brightened up at that. His wife wasn't one to laugh, always trying to keep a professional appearance, but when she found something humorous, she'd snort. "So what's the next move?" asked Daniel. "Finish dinner and then accidentally get lost?" Misty offered, before taking a sip of her water. Daniel nodded. The two of them worked for one of the Gifted Orders, a business that housed and utilized gifted humans for various jobs. Literally nothing was off limits. It was the Jackrabbit Superpower Hub. They had been hired to find Hector Vance, who was a prominent AI tech developer who had gone missing for a month. His last known location was the Belly of the Beast, the current restaurant the two were sitting in. The two of them finished their meal and paid on the electronic device at their table. They then stood and headed toward a curtained-off area at the back of the restaurant. The hallway led to the restrooms on the left and the staff kitchen area on the right. "Sneak into the kitchen?" asked Daniel. No, Misty opened her mind up once more. The regular cacophony of thoughts washed over her. Again, she felt the muted voices, more like emotions than words. She focused on them, but she noticed the more she pushed, the more the divide she was sensing resisted. "Misty," snapped Daniel. Misty came back to herself and found Daniel was holding her, his face a mask of concern. Misty caught her breath, not realizing she had been holding it. "I'm fine," she said after a moment. Daniel's face relaxed, but his eyes still held a look of concern. The two of them were about to turn when a couple came up behind them. A man and woman in their 60s. "Excuse us," said the woman. "Do you know where we can find Dr. Nigel?" Misty glanced at Daniel. He shrugged in return. "Sorry, no," he said. "No one seems to know where he is," said the man. "We have an appointment, and we were told to meet him here." "Hello." All four of them jumped and turned to see a man wearing a nice blue suit standing behind them. He adjusted his glasses before continuing. "I'm Dr. Nigel Smith. I'm looking for Mr. and Mrs. Green." The man and woman smiled and stepped forward. "Doctor, so good to finally meet you," said Mrs. Green. "Indeed," said Mr. Green. "Here we thought this had all been some elaborate ruse." "Not at all. If you would kindly follow me, we'll get started." Dr. Smith started walking towards the kitchen area, but stopped short and waved his hand. A hidden wall panel slid into a recess and to the left. Mr. and Mrs. Green looked at each other with a smile and hurriedly followed and stepped into the revealed passage. "Room for two more?" asked Misty. Dr. Nigel smiled at her request. "Of course, please." He gestured toward the passage. Daniel took his wife's arm and led the two of them after the Greens. They went down a set of stairs that opened into a quaint waiting room, cushioned sitting chairs, elevator music playing, various magazines displayed on a couple of tables. There was a room marked office and another door that read the holding room. Misty glanced at Daniel, who was focused on the holding room. "Any guess what the good doctor's holding back there?" asked Misty. "3 and the first 2 don't count," said Daniel. Misty nodded. There was a good chance Hector Vance was close by. Misty reached her mind out again, but that barrier she felt before was even more present down here. She immediately withdrew back into herself. Daniel placed his arm around her waist. "What's going on?" he muttered as he guided Misty over to one of the chairs. "Something's resisting my telepathy, and when I try to push forward, it pushes back, harder." Daniel nodded. "Explains a part I read in the case file. Arcane diviners were unable to locate Hector either, so they turned to our talents." His tone more hushed so as not to be overheard by the Greens. "So," asked Mrs. Green, "what are you hoping to get?" Misty and Daniel shared a look and then made their way over to the Greens, sitting across from the two of them. "Hoping to get?" asked Misty. "Yes," said Mr. Green. "My wife and I have always hoped to travel the world, but, well, hard times do happen," Mr. Green shrugged. "But with Dr. Nigel's help, we're hoping to change that," offered Mrs. Green. "Apologies," said Daniel. "Dr. Nigel just permitted us entrance. What exactly does he do?" The Greens smiled. "We're not quite sure how he does it, but," started Mrs. Green, "he makes the impossible a reality." Mr. Green nodded enthusiastically. "Yes," he said, "a friend of ours has been using his services to help advance his business. All that was required was that he and his brother work with Dr. Nigel for a year." "Work how?" asked Misty. The Greens shrugged. "All we know is that Gary, our friend, has a flourishing coffee business, while his brother Mike has been with Dr. Nigel for the past 6 months. "That's the usual contract, a year," said Mrs. Green. "Then after that the people are released and continue on with life as normal." Daniel and Misty shared a look. There was a clearing of throat behind them. Everyone turned to see Dr. Nigel outside his office. It occurred to Daniel and Misty that they hadn't heard him follow them down. Just like upstairs, it was as if he just appeared. Daniel grabbed Misty's hand and after a breath mentally said, "Can you sense him?" Misty responded telepathically back, "No, but that distortion I've been sensing, he's the source of it. I didn't feel that upstairs." "So he's the real deal?" asked Daniel. Misty nodded. Dr. Nigel gestured to his now open office door. "Please let us begin, Mr. and Mrs. Green, if you would." Before the Greens could stand up, Misty penetrated into their minds. "Sleep," she ordered. Within moments, the Greens' bodies went limp as they fell into a deep sleep. "My husband and I will be going first," Misty said as she stood and headed towards Dr. Nigel. Daniel followed close behind. After everyone settled into his office, Dr. Nigel sat on his side of an ornate oak wood desk, Daniel and Misty on the other side. "So then, Mrs. Day, where did I screw up?" asked Nigel. Misty smiled as he spoke her last name, clearly knowing who she and Daniel were. "Kidnapping is always a messy business, Dr. Smith. Eventually you grab the one person everyone notices." Nigel smiled in return. "Well, in all fairness, most of the people I work with know exactly where their significant other, friend, or family member are at. So it would seem someone lied about their relations." A wave of distortion radiated off of him. Misty breathed deeply and steadied herself. Daniel reflexively took her hand in his. Nigel considered Daniel for a moment. How he didn't react to his ability like so many others, intrigue and curiosity overriding his anger as he studied Daniel. Ah, yes, the invulnerable man, super strength and unbreakable fortitude. Then turning to Misty and his amazing telepathic wife and her genius IQ, "I don't normally take walk-ins, but I felt a disturbance in the force." He waved his hand absently in the air. "Apologies for my overstepping. It's usually easier to track someone down through their thought patterns," said Misty, "but clearly you have a gift for preventing such measures." The smile returned to Nigel's face. It was clear he enjoyed praise for his abilities. "So," said Daniel, "how does it work? What you do?" Nigel stood up and headed toward the door, again opening it by force of will. Misty and Daniel glanced at each other and then followed. Nigel was already in the holding room, the entrance left open. Daniel took the lead, with Misty right behind. The room was large, high-backed chairs placed throughout, where 15 people sat, men and women of various ages. 3 doors lined along the back wall. Their plaques read sleeping, restroom, and cafeteria. "My prisoners," said Nigel, disdain in his voice, "each of them willingly here. Acting as conduits for your power," said Misty, her words a statement, not a question. Nigel regarded her with a look of respect. "Indeed, Mrs. Day, indeed, I have the ability to distort reality, but only in little pockets." A look of annoyance crossed his face. No doubt regarding the limitations of his gift. "But I've learned that if I channel my power through others, it amplifies my gift significantly." "Human batteries?" asked Daniel. Nigel considered the words for a moment. Rudimentary in the explanation, but yes. "Ask Misty." Nigel smiled once more, enjoying explaining himself. Because I can. Because each of these people are my puppets, to do with as I please, while the person who entrapped them here gets to experience an amazing life. Nigel shrugged. In return, I receive a small cut of their newfound fortune, influence, or power. Because without you, none of this would be possible, said Misty. Said Nigel. But they're not kidnapped? Reiterated Daniel, sarcasm dripping from his tone. Clearly one was, or at least is believed to be. He gestured at the glazed-over stares of his guests. Tell me who you're after and they are yours. I shall even deal with the person who offered them up personally. Hector Vance, said Misty. Nigel's eyes brightened at that. I knew something was off. How so? Asked Daniel. The girl he was with, he seemed too enthusiastic to help her. Even my more willing participants have some reservations. Nigel then proceeded to look over his pets and found Hector near the back. He waved his hand, and Hector's eyes seemed to focus for a moment before he slumped out of the chair and onto the floor. Nigel waved his hand once more and prevented the young man from falling. He simply stopped in midair. Daniel rushed forward and collected him. Do see yourselves out, and please awake the greens before you go. Nigel turned and started towards the door. But just as he stepped back into his lobby, he radiated his reality distortion outward. Misty crumpled to the ground and then found herself yanked back. The door to the holding chamber slammed shut, but not before she noted all the prisoners standing up, turning towards Daniel, who was already struggling against Hector in his arms. Misty was breathing deeply, trying to regain herself. She wondered if she was somehow more susceptible to Nigel's gift because of her own psychic ability, or if everyone crumbled so easily. He kneeled down before her, his smile back and his eyes filled with malice. Truly, dear, did you think it would be that easy? Misty snorted at her own comment. You know, for a moment there, yeah, I kind of did. Silly rabbit, said Nigel. Tricks are for kids, they repeated in unison. Misty understood Nigel, his need for power, to prove himself, to be the best, all things that used to consume Misty as she grew up. Thankfully, she had people in her life that helped her understand that being the best didn't mean hurting or sacrificing others, something Dr. Nigel didn't understand. One of my guests is a telekinetic, another a pyrokinetic, a third can astral project. 3 abilities that I didn't possess until they let me in, said Nigel, as he let flames lick his hands, before willing the fire out. So, not only can you bend reality to your will, but others' gifts once you've established a link. Would you like me to applaud you? Asked Misty, her breathing returning to normal as the room slowly stopped spinning. She was worried about the prisoners. Daniel was no doubt fine thanks to his gift of super strength and invulnerability. But that doesn't mean he wouldn't defend himself if he had to. She had to get him out of there. What I want is to acquire more abilities, said Nigel, annoyance finding its way into his voice at Misty's lack of wonder about his newfound gifts. Telepathy. The ability to read minds, bend others to my will. Yes, that will be very helpful. And if I refuse, asked Misty. I can't kill your husband, but I can entrap him, said Nigel as he gestured to the holding cell to emphasize his point. Once I have you added into the collective, I'll have all the leverage I need to keep him in line. More importantly, I can distort his reality directly, meaning... You could strip him of his gifts, said Misty, fear clear in her voice. You are a smart woman, Mrs. Day, Nigel said, his tone complimentary. Misty felt sick, no longer from the reality distortion, but by what this man, monster planned to do. She questioned what it would feel like to have him rifling around her mind. Her breath caught. Let him into her mind. It was risky, but it could work. What are you thinking, Mrs. Day? I can see it in your eyes, asked Nigel, as he cupped her chin with his hand and brought her face fully up to his. Misty resisted the urge to pull back from his touch. You're right, Misty said. Nigel smiled at that. Of course I am, but why am I right? His tone shifted to demanding. I'm powerless to stop you, and Daniel is the only other gifted standing in your way. Misty allowed herself to smile. But the order that I work for will send others, especially if my husband and I don't return. Nigel considered that for a moment, then shrugged. I have sufficient money, and I only need to keep you, plus the other 3 linked to me. He nodded in agreement with himself. Yes, what do I have need of regular people? He turned his attention back to Misty. Let more of our brothers and sisters come. More to assimilate, more powers for me to acquire. He placed both his hands on the sides of her temples, applying pressure as he began to pulsate his ability into her. With your ability, I'll be able to make them all bend to my will, an army of gifted who serve me. Blindly. Misty pushed her power outward. She resisted Nigel's push as he tried to find his way into her mind. Nigel laughed. Pathetic, he said as he pushed harder. This was why he preferred more subservient guests. They were less resistant to him taking hold. But he could feel her defenses crumbling. Misty pulled more of her focus into fighting him off. Enough, Nigel snapped and pooled his own ability into a full frontal attack, letting go of everything else. He could re-establish his hold after he dominated Misty. He felt Misty's mental barrier shatter and fully penetrated her mind. Congratulations, said Misty. Nigel shot up from his position on the floor. The last thing he recalled was breaking into Misty's mind. I did it, he said with a smile. I'm in. He was in what some would call the dreamscape. Not something that was actually tangible. But it didn't matter, because once he establishes a full connection to Misty's mind, he would have full access to her power. Capable of bending both reality and people's mental states, he would be unstoppable. He cleared his throat, and as he pushed himself up, Thank you, he said regarding her praise. I must say you were stronger than anticipated, but clearly the better man won. For a man who grants people their greatest desires, said Misty, one would think they would have a keen understanding around the concept of being careful what you wish for. Nigel scoffed. Please, hold the pedantry. I won, you lost. I have no need to hear your empty prattle about the corruption of power. Misty snorted. That's annoying. Stop doing that, Nigel ordered. Misty looked at Nigel pensively. I think not. I'm in control. You don't have a choice. Are you? Am I what? Nigel snapped. In control? Obviously, Nigel said with exasperation. This was getting ridiculous. He began to draw his power and establish his connection. Nothing happened. Nigel's eyes shot open as he slowly realized that he couldn't tap into his gift. It then occurred to him that he couldn't sense anything. But Misty? There it is, said Misty, a hint of a smile on her lips. What have you done? Demanded Nigel. What have I done? Misty feigned shock and surprise at Nigel's accusation. I've done nothing. You're the one who entered my mind. So, Nigel snarled, I've done this countless times. Misty nodded. Yes, but apparently with mostly normal people, as you put it. Your point? Nigel asked. Nigel, bless your heart. The one thing keeping me from touching you was your reality distortion, said Misty as if explaining something to a child. In order to enter my mind, you had to remove the distortion so that you could reach into my mind. Yes, said Nigel, his tone questioning why that mattered. Misty sighed. You willingly entered into the mind of a telepathic gifted. Put simply, you have no power here. But you resisted me? Nigel's tone uncertain. Of course I did, said Misty, her tone chiding him. If I'd welcomed you, you wouldn't have so willing walked into my trap. Reality came crashing down on Nigel in that moment. He fought to free himself from her mind, but realized that he was fully a prisoner here. Release me, Nigel demanded. You can't keep me here forever. Oh, you're right about that, but I have no intention of setting you free, said Misty. You look tired, Nigel, like you could use a long rest. Nigel's snark returned. What do you plan to do? Make me take a big boy nap? Misty nodded at that. Yes, Nigel, that's exactly what I intend to do. The color drained from Nigel's face as it occurred to him what she meant to do. Daniel had quickly dropped Hector and locked himself in the bedroom area, using the beds to barricade the door. He had considered rushing the main entrance, but Nigel had not only sealed the door, but warped its shape, which would have forced Daniel to charge through blindly to get past it and possibly harm anyone just on the other side, a risk he wasn't willing to take. Thankfully, after Misty had placed Nigel into a coma, his grip on the people around him and his reality distortions were fully lost without his focus. His only connection was to himself now, as Misty trapped him in his own mind. The prisoners had all been released. Plus the Greens, who thankfully understood Misty's actions and thanked her for saving them. The former prisoners' loved ones, for the most part, explained the circumstances they had found themselves in because of Nigel's influence, constantly pushing them to need more and to forget about the people they left behind. For the most part, it was clear many people had been tricked. Others, like Heather Henderson, Hector's lovely date, for example, were currently on the lam for knowingly surrendering people over to Dr. Nigel. As for Nigel himself, he was in a massive security lockup facility that specialized in gifted containment. He may currently be in a coma, but that didn't mean something couldn't change at a moment's notice. A concern Misty was fully aware of as she visited him once each week to make sure he was still locked away physically and mentally, but was prepared for the day when he re-emerged. Evil like Dr. Nigel Smith didn't stay lost in the darkness forever. No, they embraced it and turned it into a weapon.